But I've got to tell you, if I'm going to talk about how paladins have changed over time, I have to tell you that when World of Warcraft first came out, paladins had some major problems with them. Even before that, when World of Warcraft was in its beta version, paladins still had problems, but they were different from the problems paladins had after the real World of Warcraft came out. And what were these problems that paladins had during the beta version? Well, they were too stinking awesome. I'm serious. Back then, they gave paladins way too much damage. Their damage actually rivaled a rogue's damage. On top of that, they had plate armor and the ability to heal themselves. When you get down to it, that is overpowered. This damage came from two strike abilities, Holy Strike and Crusader Strike. Crusader Strike was an instant attack that added a debuff to the enemy that essentially increased holy damage. It was a stackable debuff, and it was great alongside Holy Strike, which was a next melee attack that dealt holy damage. These strikes were fun to use, and they made it interesting to be in melee combat. They were both on-demand abilities that you didn't have to wait long for, but they were also too powerful. So what was Blizzard's reaction to this? Did they take those strike abilities and make them less powerful? No, they took those strike abilities out altogether and replaced it with the Seal and Judgment system. As powerful as those seals might be, or as weak as they might be in some cases, it's really not that much fun to just slap a seal on yourself and watch it do something to the enemy as you basically sit back and do nothing. It's actually pretty boring. It's a little bit like this.
Meanwhile, Tony Soprano's in a coma. There's no instant gratification. I'm getting a little bored.
Blizzard really didn't do much to mitigate this boredom. They gave us an ability called Judgment, which has different effects depending on what seal's active on us. But Judgment only has a range of about 10 yards, and originally it was just 5 yards. A lot of Judgment effects really don't do any damage, they just apply some sort of a debuff. Sometimes those debuffs are useful, other times they really aren't. And when it does do damage, it usually doesn't do that much damage, plus it's on a kind of a long cooldown, so we really don't get to do that much. When you think about the word game, you think about something that ought to be fun, not boring. And I honestly think that the lack of on-demand abilities is what makes paladins not very fun to play and is the source of the Wynadin phenomenon. And why shouldn't we whine? Blizzard took what was a good idea, albeit one with flaws, and replaced it with a bad idea. To be fair, even before the real thing came out and while we were still in beta, paladins did have a lot of buffs. But those buffs were supplemented with those on-demand strike abilities, so it really wasn't that lame. But after the real thing came out, it got replaced with no on-demand abilities. Instead, it was just chance on hit. Even our threat-producing tools were chance on hit. It was a seal called Seal of Fury. You slap it on yourself, and once in a while when you hit the enemy, it'll generate additional threat. This really wasn't a good enough tool for tanking. Maybe for off-tanking, but not for main tanking. And the one other tool that we had to generate threat at the time was Judgment of Fury. And what did that judgment do? All it did was increase the amount of threat that holy damage does on enemies. Or rather, on the one enemy you judged it on. Paladins pretty much couldn't keep more than 2 judgments up at most. Taking all that into consideration, the only types of mobs that paladins were able to tank were undead. That's it. So paladins couldn't tank and they couldn't do damage. That leaves only one role: healing. Well, that and casting buffs on allies. What was supposed to be a hybrid class was crammed into a single role. Admittedly, we did that role pretty well when we were spec'd for it and played properly. But what does played properly entail? Basically, it entails being at the back of the raid. We're a plate-wearing class, and we're not on the front lines. Yeah, real good move, Blizzard. It gets worse. While we're at the back of the raids, there's nothing we can do besides healing and buffing. We don't have any ranged damage options. That's right, we can't even use stuff like guns and bows, and we don't have any ranged direct damage spells, so all we could do is buff and heal. Now that I think about it, maybe Holy Shock was put at the top of the Holy Tree to try to mitigate this. But since that spell had a 30-second cooldown, didn't do that much damage, couldn't be improved with gear because there was no gear, and had a very punishing mana cost, It was not an effective way of alleviating that. Honestly, if you're going to do something like that, make it effective. Besides Holy Shock, which sucked, all of our offensive options were melee, and they weren't useful or strong enough to have us in the front of raids. It's almost as if there were two ideas at Blizzard as to what a paladin ought to be. The first one is that they're tanks, who are primarily and in fact only melee oriented. They heal only once in a while, they do damage up close and personal, and this is pretty close to the traditional RPG view of what a paladin ought to be. It accounts for the fact that we've only got 2 heal spells, and the fact that we don't have any ranged damage options. The second idea of what a paladin ought to be is someone who's basically a healer who can take a hit. They're in the back of the raid, casting buffs on allies, healing, and this would account for the fact that our melee options really suck, and for the fact that we can't tank. The healer who can take a hit view is actually pretty close to the Warcraft 3 version of what a paladin is. And it's like when those two ideas clashed, Blizzard was like, let's make a compromise. Let's make a paladins a class that can only heal, and then only give them melee damage options. I guess that kind of makes us a hybrid class. Except, hybrid classes are inherently supposed to be versatile. And versatile means that you're not crammed into just one role. We were crammed into just one role. That kind of defeats the purpose of having a hybrid class at all, and most importantly, it keeps the game from being fun. And if a game isn't fun, then what is that game? Well, there are plenty of bad game reviews on YouTube that will tell you that with better eloquence than I have. And what's the point in giving plate armor to someone who's just going to be in the back of the raid anyway? That plate armor doesn't do anyone any good if it's not helping to absorb damage. So it's really no wonder that a lot of paladins didn't wear plate back then. They'd wear stuff like chain, leather, or even cloth. Anything that would be helpful with mana or with healing. I have to admit, I was one of those paladins who didn't wear plate. The fact that there wasn't very much plate armor that helped with healing was another indication that Blizzard didn't like paladins. With no gear and no options, paladins were pretty bad off back then. But there's another indication from way back then that's still around today, and it's not likely to go away. It didn't have much to do with gameplay, but let me tell you, it was a clear indication from Blizzard that they didn't like paladins.